This is They Create Worlds, episode 250, Mastertronic.
If anybody wants to find me, I'll be in the last place you would look. In a place where people used to be, a land that's called reality, you'll find me there.
Welcome to They Create Worlds. I'm Jeffrey, and I'm joined by my co-host, Alex.
Hello.
We join you once again across the water in the wonderful lands of Great Britain in order to talk about 250 Mediatronics. Games, of course.
Something like that. That's right. This is our 250th episode of They Create Worlds. We didn't really want to celebrate this as a milestone. We just had our big 10th anniversary milestone. That seems like a far bigger deal, but we wanted to do something that was a little bit of a play on the number 250. It's a bit of a stretch to get there, but in Britain in the 1980s, in the mid to late 1980s, budget software ruled the 8-bit scene. Much of that budget software went for £2.50. So, 250. Now, the company we're actually covering sold their software for even cheaper than that. That's why it's a bit of a slant, because the company we're referring to, Mastertronic, actually sold for £1.99, but it's still in the spirit of budget software, which they pioneered. So it's a budget software episode 250, celebrating the innovative company Mastertronic.
Now, I don't think I've ever heard of Mastertronic before. I don't think they released anything in the United States. I'm presuming they are only a British-only publisher?
Well, they did release some things in the United States in the middle of the 1980s, which we'll talk about, but they didn't have success in that form in the United States. Now, their U.S. branch would go on to greater success, and you have definitely heard of them in their later form as Virgin Interactive Entertainment.
That I have heard of, yes.
But that's a subject for a different episode, perhaps the episode directly following this one, hint, hint. But yes, Mastertronic itself was really ensconced in Europe and had a couple of claims to fame. First of all, it was the progenitor of the budget software field. They might not have been the first people to sell dirt cheap software, but they were the company that established budget software as a business, as a line, as something that people consciously do. And their other big claim to fame is that they brought the Sega Master System and the Sega Mega Drive, known as the Genesis in the United States, to the United Kingdom and much of Europe in the late 1980s. So kind of two really big things. And then they went on, the company was split in various ways, which we'll talk about at the end of the episode. And basically some of it continued on as Virgin, some of it continued on as Sega Europe. Oversimplifying there slightly, but we'll get into the details as the episode goes along.
So where do we start here? Roughly, when did they come about? I know there was the big bedroom coder thing in Great Britain. We covered a lot of that with the British 8-bit computer hardware and software episodes. Mm-hmm. Where in that grand timeline does Mastertronic come in?
Yeah, so the idea for the company originated in 1983. It was formally incorporated on the 1st of April, 1984, though they had been operating it for a few months before incorporation. But we really have to go back slightly earlier than that and set up a little bit of the scene in 1982, 1983 in Britain. Now, we're not going to go in depth there. We do have an episode where we kind of just broadly looked at the 8-bit software market. We've also looked at some of the other stuff going down at this time. But we do need to put a little bit of context in here because the market in this period was a very small market and it was a very confused market. There had been a computer market of some form or another in the United Kingdom, including with games to one degree or another, since 1978. Though really it was around 1980 with the release of the ZX80 that it really started to get going in any meaningful way. But this was a small market. There were a small number of computers on the market, primarily from Acorn and Sinclair. We have an 8-bit hardware episode in Britain where you can get more detail on all of that. The business at this time was largely very mom and pop, very mail order. You had these small companies run by one or two people that were primarily going around to micro fairs conventions around the country dedicated to computer hardware and software, meeting and signing up independent coders, many of whom were, as you alluded to before, teenagers, the famed bedroom coders of Britain. Some of them were older than that, some of them a lot older than that. But that was kind of the vibe of the business in like the 1980, 1981, 1982 time period. It was very small. It was mostly mail order. And there were a lot of just very small firms. Some of them were well run. Some of them were not well run. Some of the games were pretty good considering the hardware. Some of the games were absolute rubbish. The games were relatively expensive considering your return on them. A lot of games were selling for $7.99, $8.99, somewhere in that area. Some, I'm sure, were also a little cheaper, but this was kind of where the price point was developing. We have to remember a couple of things there. First, for our American listeners, the British pound is stronger than the American dollar and was also back then stronger than the American dollar. So that's more expensive than that in dollars for those that need that frame of reference. Probably about twice as expensive in dollars. The other thing is that, as we've talked about in other episodes, this was a cassette market. The computers that these early games were being released on were very limited in memory, usually ranging from 1K to 16K. The medium was cassette. The market was not at this time moving to floppy disk in the United Kingdom. You had games that were very memory constrained and had very slow loading times and on a serial media. These games had to be pretty simple just by the nature of the hardware. While for a good game, that price that was being asked, 5, 6, 7, 8 pounds, was not necessarily unreasonable. It was unreasonable if you got yourself a stinker, and there were a lot of stinkers out there. Since the industry was new, there wasn't necessarily a robust magazine culture supporting it, giving reviews of games. It could be very hard to tell what was good or not. This created a lot of problems, not just for end users, not just for customers who were largely children or teenagers that only had a limited amount of pocket money and had to really make sure they hit the right product or they were not going to be able to recover. But it was also a problem for retailers. There was some small amount of penetration into some of the high street shops, including the newsagent W.H. Smith's, the chemist Boots. There was a little bit of penetration of some computer software next to the hardware in this early period. But since a lot of these companies were very small and very fly-by-night, there wasn't a lot of retailer confidence necessarily either. Retailers want to deal with companies that they know are going to be around in a year and are going to have a buyback plan to take back unsold stock. They want some consistency and regularity in their business dealings, and there wasn't necessarily that in this early period. So while some software did get stocked in retail and even in some of the high street chains, it was somewhat intermittent in this period of time, and there was a lot of uncertainty around that, which is why a lot of the business was still mail order. It wasn't exclusively mail order, but a lot of it was still mail order at this time. The other thing is that there was a console industry. We talked about this in our first 10 years of European consoles at our other milestone episode celebrating 10 years of the podcast. There was a console industry in Britain and in Europe. Was it big? No. Was it as huge as it was in the United States? Absolutely not. But it existed, and that's where a lot of the focus of the bigger chains in the country was really focused on. Because those were from real companies, reliable companies, it was in that sense felt more established. There had been some moves in 1982 and 1983 by a small number of companies to push further into retail. Probably the most famous of the companies that were doing this was the company Imagine Software, which we won't go into detail here. They deserve their own small episode because their story is so wild at some point. There were a small number of companies like Imagine that were starting to push into retail a little more. But the uncertainties in the marketplace kind of killed this. 1982 ended up being a year where retailers kind of underestimated what the demand for computer games were going to be. This is when the ZX Spectrum's coming out, Commodore 64. I don't recall exactly when it hit England as opposed to the US, but it came out in the US at least in 1982, was on its way to the United Kingdom in this time period. These new computers, the C64 and the ZX Spectrum, were pushing a bigger market because they were more capable machines, particularly the ZX Spectrum in 1982. There was an underestimation of demand, so retailers got caught out not having as much software as they might have liked. This led to some over-ordering in 1983. There was actually a shakeout and a crash in the British computer game industry in 1983, happening at the same time as the video game crashes happening in the United States. Partially driven by some of the events happening in the United States as well. It's become very fashionable to point out that the video game crash in 1983 was the North American video game crash because everyone else around the world went on having a good time. That's true as far as it goes. I'm not saying that the factors that were crashing the market in North America were happening at the same time in Britain as well to destroy that market entirely, because that's not what happened. But it's become so fashionable to ignore the crash altogether outside of the United States that sometimes we miss some of the nuances going on. Because the North American video game market crashed, the British console market did disappear in this time period. Now, that market wasn't so big. Like I said a few minutes ago, it wasn't underpinning the entire industry. So did the consoles going away cause the ZX Spectrum distress? Did it cause the computer game publishers distress? Of course not, because they were truly separate markets. But from a retail perspective, this is what a lot of the high street chains and the specialty shops were carrying, were consoles. Even if they weren't selling a lot of them, they were carrying them. All of that stuff suddenly going belly up and vanishing did play on the minds of some of these retailers. Some of these retailers were not interested in carrying on in the computer game business. So that did kind of shrink the overall market for these kind of games a little bit in the United Kingdom, even if it was not a direct impact on the computer manufacturers or the computer game publishers in the country. Then at the same time, you had this shakeout in the computer game market, where there had been underordering in 82, followed by overordering in 83, followed by order cancellations and returns. The same kind of market forces that sank the US console market were also playing out in the British computer game market. Now, they were unrelated. The underordering in 82 and overordering in 83 in the United Kingdom had nothing to do with whatever Atari was doing in North America. I want to be very clear that I'm not trying to fully link these two events. What was going on in Britain was separate, other than the fact that the consoles vanishing did give some retailers pause. Other than that, we're talking completely separate events.
Largely parallel evolution.
Exactly. But they actually had a shakeout at the same time. And Imagine was one of the companies that was really badly caught up in this, but there were a couple of other companies that ran into trouble and ceased operations in this same time period. Like, there was a real shakeout. I think the average consumer didn't really see this because not all of the companies went away. There were still companies that bridged this gap and continued releasing games. There wasn't a sophisticated trade press around computer games, and teenagers weren't paying attention to the fortunes of individual companies. I think a lot of people that were there at the time, it's similar to what we've talked about in the US, where people that played their Atari VCSs and then moved on to their C64s are like, well, there wasn't a crash because I just moved to my C64 and I still had games. I'm sure someone who was a teenager or a kid in this period would be like, well, there wasn't a crash because there were always games available. And that's true. The market didn't go away. It wasn't as severe as what happened in the United States, where video games just stopped for 2 years, console games. But it was a shakeout, and people that were in the industry at the time, that were at the companies making the games at the time, have acknowledged that there was a shakeout in this time period. There were a few things going on here, to summarize, that made the market going into 1984 very unstable in the United Kingdom. One of those is that there was the shakeout in the industry, and there was retailer reluctance because of the continued fluctuation of the market, overordering, underordering, never being able to figure out what's going on, fly-by-night companies disappearing. There was a great retailer reluctance to heavily stock computer games. Some chains were stocking them, some companies were successful getting their games in, but there was a general overall reluctance to stock. Number two is that games were expensive relative to their quality, and it was hard to determine the quality before making your purchasing choice. This led to a consumer reluctance to want to buy too many games and a consumer turn towards piracy. We've talked about this in other episodes, and obviously software piracy is always a thing, and it's not unique to this place and time. But in Britain, they were using a cassette medium. Around 1983, cheap double cassette decks from companies like Amstrad started to become readily available, which meant that it was very, very easy, even easier than copying that floppy in the late 80s and early 90s. It was really easy to copy games, and people had the materials to copy those games very easily. With the market so uncertain and the prices being so out of whack sometimes with the quality, there was a big turn to piracy. Obviously, publishers always moan about piracy. Consumers always say, well, it's not as bad as the publishers say it is. The truth is, as always, somewhere in the middle, but I do think it's fair to say, judging by what was going on at Imagine and a few other companies at this time, I think it's fair to say that piracy was doing more harm in this time period than piracy has generally done. Like, this was a particularly acute time, and it was causing trouble for the publishers. There were a couple of things that seemed to be needed here. One of these was professional, grown-up, adult distribution. Publisher that was familiar with how retail and how wholesale and how distribution worked, so that they could be very professional on that end and regain the confidence of the retail sector. The other thing is games that were priced in a way that took into account the varying quality, the small amount of spending money available, and quite frankly became such an easy purchase that people didn't just automatically turn to piracy by default. It's not that piracy is ever going to go away, but whenever a company makes it easier to get something legitimately, piracy goes down. Because depending on the medium or the thing you're trying to get, piracy can be a hassle. So there's always this point where it's like, okay, it is just easier to buy this thing for this little price than go through the effort of pirating it. That's where Mastertronic comes in. Mastertronic was founded by 4 individuals, and we'll talk about all of them as they come into the story. But the main individual who was the driving force behind the founding of the company was a gentleman by the name of Frank Herman, known as Uncle Frank to many of his employees, not meant in a creepy way. Frank Herman had a background in chartered accountancy and investment banking. He had been involved in these fields for about 30 years until the oil crisis of 1973 during the Arab oil embargo caused the company he was managing that time to go under, and he spent the next 5 years basically unemployed, scrambling to make ends meet. That situation ended for him in 1978 when he found himself a new business importing video cassettes from the United States. This is right in the period of time. Betamax has been released several years ago. VHS had been introduced as well. The wars between VHS and Beta, not to mention the consortium approach that VHS was taking, was starting to drive down the prices of what were sometimes called VTRs, videotape recorders, and sometimes at this point called VCRs, video cassette recorders, to prices that, while still expensive, were more affordable by families. As is the case usually when there's a new medium like this, the motion picture companies who actually made the movies, they weren't quite sure what to make of this at first. And so a lot of these video cassette rights ended up in the hands of small companies, particularly for B movies, lesser features. There came to be this kind of cottage industry around films on video cassette, on videotape. Frank Herman, because he had been an investment banker for so long, had contacts in the United States. He'd worked with a lot of banks in the United States. So he kind of knew how to get a transatlantic trade going, and he knew how to deal with the banks in the U.S. and get capital together and all of that. In 1978, he started a business importing video cassettes into the United Kingdom. That business did pretty well for him until about 1982. By 1982, the VCR market and the video cassette market is really starting to mature. The motion picture studios and producers are realizing what they have here. They're, quite frankly, feeling more threatened by it than embracing it at this point. Like when Empire Strikes Back famously comes out on video cassette for $80. because they don't want you to buy it on video cassette. They want you to see it in the theater. So they're starting to reassert control. So this cottage industry that developed in the United Kingdom of these imports started to go bust. These video shops and these video importers were starting to have some real trouble. And so around 1982, Frank Herman decides that he really needs to diversify his business. He kind of notices this whole computer game thing that's starting to take off. Its tapes, videotape, and audio tape are not that different from the perspective of duplicating, distributing, wholesaling, selling, etc. So this feels like a business that he can move into. It's interesting, the way he actually discovers that this could be a really big business is through an association with a company called Videotapes International, which was run by two individuals by the name of Martin Alper and Terry Medway, two more of our founders of Mastertronic. Videotapes International was another link in this chain. They were managing video stores. Herman is bringing the tapes into the country. Alper and Medway, through their company, they own a video store, and from the sources we have, it appears that they also managed some other video stores as well, that they were also serving as a distributor into other video stores, in addition to owning their own store. During this bust, one of their stores actually went bankrupt and couldn't pay all their bills to Videotapes International. So the owner of the store offered to compensate Alper and Medway with some Commodore 64 games that he had, because video stores in this period were trying to diversify a little bit because they were running into these problems that the business was starting to fall apart. He gave those games to Alper. Alper sold them almost immediately at huge margins, because he sold these games for around £10. They didn't take that much to make, so the margins were super high. So in early 1983, he showed this to Herman. Herman had started looking around in 82 for ways to diversify. Then in early 83, he visits Alper. Alper's like, look at this. I am making so much money on this. We should go into this business together. Herman immediately recognizes this as being a great idea and was like, yes, absolutely. Let's do this. So they decided to go into this business together. At this point, they needed a place to establish this business. Alper and Medway had a video shop in George Street in London. Their building that they were in was managed by a company called Hirschfields. Hirschfields was a chartered surveyor, which in the British context, what that means is they were a company that assessed properties to set mortgage rates. They assessed property values, and then they also, Hirschfields at least, managed some properties. Hirschfields managed this building, but it was just one of many buildings they managed. They didn't have a direct relationship with Alper and Medway. But one of the partners of this company, Hirschfields, Colin Gershenson, was someone who was known to Frank Herman, because Frank Herman was big on doing charitable works, and he and Gershenson were in some of the same charity circles. So Herman approaches Gershenson to help them find a place for their business. Gershenson also ends up involving another partner in the firm, Alan Sharam, to help them get set up with a location and get their inventory squared away and everything else. So that's our fourth founder here, Alan Sharam, or Sharam, I don't know how he pronounces it. To recap, we have Frank Herman, who's been importing videotapes from the United States after a long career as a chartered accountant and investment banker. We have Alper and Medway, owners of Videotapes International, who have their own video store on George Street in London and have also been supplying tapes to other stores as well. And then we have the manager of their building, Hirschfields, where one of the partners, Alan Sharam, comes along to help them get set up with a location and help them deal with their inventory. Together, these four individuals found Mastertronic. They start business together in late 1983, though they officially incorporate on April 1st, 1984.
Where did the name come from?
There isn't a good explanation as to the history of the name. Unfortunately, all of the partners, at least most of them, are dead now. I'm not sure if Terry Medway's gone, but Herman, Alper, and Sharam all died between 2009 and 2015. Alper was interviewed some, Herman and Sharam less so. We don't have a good idea, except they liked the idea of master to unify lines, and their plan had been that they might use master with a bunch of different types of things. Later on in the company's history, they very, very briefly, in 1987 or so, start another couple of lines. They publish records under the name Master Sound. They publish videos under the name Master Vision. So I think the idea was master is a powerful word indicating dominance or expertise in an area, and then they could pair the word master with whatever they wanted. And in this case, Mastertronic for electronics. That's kind of where it comes from. Now, the partners decided that they needed a different approach from what was currently going on in the market, because they realized that there wasn't a lot of retail confidence in the sector, and that they really needed to establish reputable business at high volume in order to be able to get the high street shops on board. They needed to come across as a big, professionally run company. They also knew that the margins on games sold at 7 or 8 or 10 pounds were pretty darn high. I mean, you made good money on that, but that was way out of sync with the amount of money that actually took to make these games. While there was something nice about having huge margins like that, they realized that they could probably lower the price quite significantly and still make a profit on each copy sold. And by lowering the price and lowering the margins, they would have such high volume sales that would make up for the deficiency, and they would actually end up perhaps making more money because they would sell so many games that even though the margin on each individual copy would be fairly small, overall they would end up with far higher sales. This would also allow them to sell into retail in bulk, which would further allow them to realize a great return on investment because they would have big bulk discounts. Now, none of these guys were game players. Not at all. None of these four. Could not care less about games. In later years, they would proudly boast about how they were not game players. But they understood retail distribution. They understood wholesaling. They understood distribution. And with Sharam, however he pronounces it, they also had a good understanding of property values and real estate. They had all of the skills that they needed, other than knowing the first thing about games, to really be successful. They established their own warehouse so that they could do their own wholesaling. They emulated what they had been doing previously in video cassettes by creating these blister packs, which were these pre-assembled kind of racks full of a set number of games that they could just sell directly to retailers. So the retailer wouldn't have to worry about, I know nothing about games, which ones of yours are good, I'll take 2 of these and 4 of these, I don't know. They could just come in and be like, here's a pack of 100 games. They are all £1.99 each. They are super cheap. They will fly off the shelves. You don't have to do anything. We will come in, we will set this up for you. They were rack jobbers, essentially, which we've talked about in other episodes. Similar to back in the day when you had the discount DVD bins up front in a Walmart. Walmart didn't stock those discount DVD bins. They hired rack jobbers to come in and just put a display up for them, fire and forget. This was a similar idea. It's like, you don't have to worry. We're just going to give you this product at a really cheap price. You put it in your store, and you make money, and we'll restock you when you need to be restocked, and you don't even have to think about it. They contracted with a former cricketer named Richard Bealby, who had worked with Herman in the past on distributing video cassettes, to be their initial distributor. They were responsible for sourcing the games, duplicating the tapes, packaging the games, warehousing the games. Richard Bealby and his organization would actually go out to all the individual stores and be like, here's games, you want them? So they had this huge network right away because they already knew the trade from the video business. And with the video business drying up, retailers were willing to take a chance on this. They weren't so much getting at first into the big high street shops as they were getting into small, sometimes independently owned news agents, sweet shops, convenience stores, gas stations, garages, businesses that you wouldn't necessarily associate with computer games or video games, not big department stores or electronics stores or camera stores or that kind of thing, many of which were still hesitant, some of which had been burned by the video game crash in the United States, the vanishing of that inventory in Europe. But getting into a lot of these small shops that would not have the expertise or the energy to have to go out and buy computer games themselves and create their own displays, but were happy to just take a Mastertronic bundle and just display them in their store.
It really ties into the impulse drive, especially at £2.
Exactly. Yeah.
How many of us have been in the checkout line waiting, twiddling our thumbs, why can't this person in front of me go faster? And you have all these things that are right there as impulse drives, candy bars, mints, little magazines, little toys, drinks, all sorts of things. I know I've bought some of those on occasion. I know you probably have too, Alex.
Absolutely.
I'm sure probably 99% of those listening have done that at some point in their lives. It works.
Exactly. So, of course, this is only going to work if they actually have a broad selection of games. Because it's all fine and good to have cheap games and make them readily available and everything, but if you don't have a lot of games, you're not going to sell at the volume you need to make this work. Basically, as they're getting set up here, Alan Sharam takes a year off from the surveying business. I mean, eventually commits to the company fully, but at the start, he takes a year off from his surveying business and just starts attending computer fairs all over the country and starts signing up these bedroom coders. I mean, there's so many of them. This is right in the middle of the bedroom coder revolution. It's a period of uncertainty in retail. It's a period where there's just been kind of a market shakeout in the computer game business. So a lot of these bedroom coders need a home. Mastertronic is willing to give them a home. They sign up a lot of individuals and small companies to make games for them. Most of these games are your typical kind of arcade knockoff kind of things of popular stuff at the time, like your Space Invaders, your Asteroids, your Centipede, that kind of thing. Many of these games were not particularly remarkable, but they were good enough, and they were so cheap that you felt like you were getting bang for your buck. There were a couple of things that stood out just a little more than that. Two of their most prolific early suppliers were a company called Mr. Chip Software, which was later more well-known in the British computer game business as Magnetic Fields, and the company Galactic Software, founded by the Darling brothers and their father, Jim, who would become far more famous for their next company, Codemasters. They got a couple of more interesting games from them. They got a game from Mr. Chip called Vegas Jackpot, a casino game kind of game. They got a really slick bike racing game, BMX Racer, from Galactic Software. You know, these games sold in excess of 300,000 units apiece, all by themselves. Altogether, in their first year, they were selling hundreds of thousands of units of games. A lot on the Commodore 64, especially in their first year, the Commodore 64 and the VIC-20. In that first year, they actually sold more on those two platforms than they did on the Spectrum. It was kind of according to Andrew Guter, who came in 1985 to run their finances, and from the looks of interviews he's given, kept some of the records from the company when he left, so he still had those to reference. They sold about 66% of their product in the first year on the Commodore 64 and the VIC-20. Of course, still on cassette tape. They weren't doing floppy disk or cartridge on either of those platforms. That balance would shift after that first year, with the Spectrum becoming more important in subsequent years and the Amstrad lines as well as those came along. They were on all of those major platforms from the very beginning with these blister packs, selling these games for $1.99 each. They were a good impulse buy. It felt like something you could take a chance on. Some of them were better than others. Some of them were simpler than others, but at $1.99, they all felt like you were getting something for your money. You know, it was easier to impulse buy that than to pirate. It almost didn't feel like it was worth pirating. And so this took off. They sold hundreds of thousands and then millions of these games. Their two best sellers were those two, probably Vegas Jackpot and BMX Racer, that sold 300,000 plus each. Some of the others individually didn't sell much, but they were flooding the market with so many games that they were just super successful. And this was the beginning of a whole new category in games in the United Kingdom, which was budget software. This was a great business for them throughout 84, 85, 86, and it led them to some other opportunities along the way. At first, they had real problems getting into the high street shops. Even some of those high street shops that were already taking games like Boots Dixon's and W.H. Smith weren't necessarily interested in dealing with them at first. But once word got around about how successful they are, they started getting into some of these high street locations as well and became so well known for being such great experts at distribution that they ended up, one of the big holdouts on high street throughout this entire period had been Woolworths, which was a major discount department store and had carried video games like, Atari-style console games in the past, but had never really warmed up to the idea of getting involved in computer games. Woolworth resisted their entreaties for a long time, but finally they couldn't ignore anymore how big this thing was becoming. And when Woolworth finally came around, not only did they start taking Mastertronic software, but they actually made Mastertronic their exclusive stalker, their exclusive supplier of software. Not only were they selling their software into Mastertronic, but anyone who wanted to get their software into Woolworths had to go through Mastertronic to do it. They ended up with a similar arrangement with Toys R Us as well. They were just such a great distribution operation that they were able to take over supplying some entities, including major entities like Woolworth and Toys R Us, with all of their software, not just Mastertronic products. They are flying high, and their margins are low, but their overhead is low too. They can duplicate very cheaply. Their royalties to developers are only about 5 pence to 10 pence, which again doesn't seem like a lot, except that they sell so many copies of their games, hundreds of thousands of copies of just about everything they put out.
Even at 5 or 10 pence a copy, when you're talking about hundreds of thousands of copies, that's still a significant amount of money.
Exactly. It adds up over time. They have something really good going. It helps to revive and expand the industry. Other companies start doing their own budget software as well, realizing that this is a major area. Some of them are not able, as I said at the top of the hour, to get down quite to the $199 that Mastertronic is offering. Some of them go for $250 instead, hence doing this in episode 250. But there's a whole new segment of the market. This comes in for some criticism. There's an idea that this is racing to the bottom and cheapening the product and all of this kind of thing, which are valid concerns. Definitely valid concerns. There comes a point where if you price something too cheaply, you might get over the pirates and you might get down to impulse buy territory, but you might also end up with something that doesn't feel like it has any value as well. Obviously, at that price, you have to cut some corners. I mean, 8-bit software can be made pretty cheaply, but you could have probably gotten slightly better product if you were able to charge more for it than this. There are some valid criticisms of how this kind of transformed the market into a race to the bottom, low quality, cheap software kind of market, but it's also the market that could be born when you consider the age and financial capabilities of the consumer, as well as the ever-present threat of piracy. Since this was an audio cassette market rather than a floppy market, there was always going to be an upper bound to how sophisticated of games you could make anyway, because the medium was going to stop you no matter what at some point. So even though certainly you could go a little higher quality than what Mastertronic was pushing, it's not like you could get just the most amazing games on the 8-bit platforms because you were always constrained by that cassette medium. That was doing them really good business for a while. But there was a problem on the horizon, and that problem was the coming of the 16-bit computers. Most notably the Atari ST and the Amiga. Started showing up in 85 and 86. It would be a little longer before they started really cutting into the 8-bit computer market in the United Kingdom, but it was very clear that the market was going to go 16-bit. It was very clear that the same model that they were using on 8-bit platforms was not going to work on the 16-bit platforms. Budget software as a concept made sense on these 8-bit platforms where you did have an upper limit on game quality defined by memory restraints that many users had, defined by being on an audio cassette medium, defined by this more primitive environment that these games were played on. 16-bit. Those computers could do so much more with graphics and sound and animation and colors and all of this crazy stuff. And of course, by now, it's a disc medium as well. We're no longer talking about a cassette medium. They tried at first to do 16-bit budget software. They established a label called 16 Blitz and tried to do budget software, in this case, selling more like £4.99 because it has to be on disk and it's going to be more expensive.
Higher overhead.
Yep. And it never really took. So the mid-'80s are kind of defined by the company trying to figure out a lot of ways to diversify their business and stay relevant, because none of these guys, by this point, Medway, I'm pretty sure, is gone. He left pretty early in the company's history, but the other three are all still here, Herman, Alper, and Sharam. None of these guys care much about games. None of these guys are big into games. None of these guys feel nostalgic about games. They're just in a business where they thought that they could make some money. Their goal was to get rich quick as they could. Take the company public if they could. That never worked out, but in theory. Or just flood various avenues with product and reap as much money as they could while they could, and then, get out. Like, they weren't really wedded to the game business. So they start in the mid-'80s trying a wide variety of things to keep the company relevant, as the budget software still is successful for a while, but is clear is going to start becoming less important in their overall business. Some of those things are very successful, like the previously mentioned deals with Woolworths and Toys R Us to be their sole supplier of software. They also start in the middle of the decade contracting with other British software companies to do re-releases of some of their older software as budget games. They bring in a new head of marketing named Jeff Heath in 1986. Heath comes to them from Melbourne House, another major British publisher with ties to Australia. He had also, before that, been at Activision, which had a very robust UK division and did a lot of UK software. So he had some real contacts in the industry. Under Heath, they do a couple of things. They start making deals. They start first looking into maybe getting into full-price software for the first time. But they also start making deals with a lot of companies to re-release their older games as budget software. And they found new labels to do that. They start a label called Ricochet to do some of this initially. Jeff Heath gets in with his old buddies at Activision and gets the classic Commodore 64 game Ghostbusters. They re-released that on Ricochet, and it's a huge success, sells 450,000 units. They also get Way of the Exploding Fist from Melbourne House, a somewhat popular fighting game a couple of years prior. They get Activision's Aliens game, which was very fondly remembered in the United Kingdom. They also go to some other smaller companies and get some of their games as well to re-release their properties.
Sort of like US Gold in a way.
Yes, and then in fact, funnily enough, they do a similar deal with US Gold to re-release a lot of their games as budget games under the Americana label. They also make a deal with another company called Hewson, which was a mid-tier British publisher in the 1980s, and release some of their old games under the label Racket, and then a second label, Rebound. They create all of these budget labels where they're releasing other companies' games as well that had started as first-run games in the United Kingdom. They do this throughout 1987 and into 1988 and beyond. Heath also ends up purchasing Melbourne House, or the company does, once Heath gets there. I mean, Heath's not in charge of the company. He's just taking a big role in marketing. They purchased Melbourne House, which was having some trouble, and want to use that as a vehicle to get into full-price software. The other thing that they do kind of throughout this period, even all the way back to 1984 when the budget business is still going well, is they decide to try to get into the United States and introduce the budget game concept across the pond. In 1984, they go to CES. They actually appear at the CES show, specifically to the summer CES in Chicago, with some of their early budget games, and actually make a partnership with a video cassette company in the United States, Classic Family Entertainment, which Herman had dealt with in the past because they had rights to some children's and other specialty programs in the United States that then he brought over to the United Kingdom. They make a deal with this video cassette company, Classic Family Entertainment, and create a joint venture called Mastertronic Inc. in the United States to try to sell their product there, looking to sell at a price of about $8.99. They have to go a little more expensive here because they have to be disc-based games in the United States. There is no cassette market. The cassette market in the United States disappeared very quickly at the end of the 1970s, beginning of the 1980s. But they set up this Mastertronic Inc., not to be confused with the parent company, Mastertronic Limited, in the United Kingdom, to sell games at $8.99, and they're trying to go for some of the same kind of places that are taking the games in the United Kingdom. Drugstores, record stores, mass merchandisers, just trying to get their blister packs, their racks, wherever they can get them. It doesn't go over well. It's the same fare they're selling in the UK. The UK games in general, I mean, they're Commodore 64 games. Obviously, they're not selling Spectrum games in the US because the Spectrum basically never appeared in the US. There was the brief Timex Sinclair 2000. Look at our Home Computer Wars episode for those attempts by Sinclair to get into the US. But there is no Spectrum market in the US, of course. That's Europe specific. It's their Commodore 64 stuff, and then also maybe trying to get some IBM PC stuff as well. The games in Britain in general at the budget software level just aren't as sophisticated as what's in the United States. Yeah, they're still cheaper at $8.99. They're at a more budget price point, but the market in the US is less of a teenage market. It's an older, more affluent market. They're happy to pay more for better games. This thing doesn't work very well. Entertainment falls apart pretty quickly. They cut ties, and sometime in 1985, Mastertronic Inc. starts going their own way in the US. They make a deal with a disc duplicator in Frederick, Maryland, and do a joint venture with them, 80% owned by Mastertronic, 20% owned by the owner of the factory, a guy named Gary Snyder. They do that for a little bit. They're still not getting any headway. Finally, in 1986, Martin Alper, who is considered to be kind of the best marketer and deal maker amongst the founders, comes over to the United States and sets up a new development and software procurement arm of Mastertronic Inc. in Costa Mesa, California. So now at this point, the idea is rather than trying to just flog their British budget software in the United States, which isn't going very well, they're actually going to set up a branch in the US, in California, that will set up its own development operation and also source American software and try to break into the market that way instead, because it's just not working to bring the British stuff over. That's all we're going to say about the US branch of Mastertronic right now. We'll talk about it a little more when we return to this topic from the point of view of Virgin Interactive Entertainment, because this development branch that Martin Alper sets up is going to become that U.S. branch of Virgin Interactive Entertainment, is going to become a very important, very major player for a brief period of time in the U.S. market, but that's mostly going to happen under Virgin. It's not going to happen under Mastertronic. Frank Herman is now kind of running the show in Britain. Alan Sharam is still there in Britain, largely dealing with distribution and sales. Jeff Heath, who they brought over from Melbourne House, is handling marketing and is also trying to move them into the kind of full price software area. Martin Alper is now out in the US trying to establish a new branch in California. That's kind of the situation circa 1986, 1987. Even though that Mastertronic Inc. branch in the US won't do anything super important in the Mastertronic days in terms of developing software, there is one very important thing that comes out of Martin Alper going to the United States. And that is, being in the US, he gets wind of this new thing, the Nintendo Entertainment System. Video games are back, baby. Martin Alper has a front row seat in the United States.
But not the Famicom.
No, because it's 1986, so the NES has come out by this time. You know, these people aren't game players, like I said, but Martin Alper is very interested in this and sees that this looks like it's going to be a very profitable category. He goes to his partners and says, I've seen this amazing thing in the US. We have got to get in on this. I think this is going to be big. They're big in Japan. They're just launching in the US. They don't have anything in Europe yet. This could be our opportunity to get in on the ground floor, leverage our broad distribution across all levels of retail, from gas stations to Woolworths and Toys R Us. Not that they'd sell an NES in a gas station, but I'm just saying they have broad distribution across the entirety of British retail.
I'm just picturing now going into a Love's gas station and seeing, it, along with the teddy bears and the trucks and the wherever you are in the States, you see the Route 66 Nintendo there ready for you to pick up, along with the accompanying racing game or something.
Indeed. So we've got this broad distribution. We could secure the UK rights for this thing and we could make a lot of money. So the partners are like, yeah, sure, that makes a lot of sense. So they go to Nintendo, and Nintendo's like, no. You may be big players in this piddly little budget software thing you're talking about, but this is big, serious stuff, and we need big, serious companies, and you are too small fry to handle our product. They are not interested in letting Mastertronic have the Nintendo Entertainment System. They end up going through other companies in Europe, like Bandai and Mattel, bigger toy companies, before they finally, several years later, establish their own Nintendo European operation. That doesn't work out. But as they're kind of looking into this whole thing, they end up connecting with a gentleman by the name of Anton Bruhl, who had been the president of the international division of Atari during the heyday. Joined the company in 1979 and was there throughout the heyday and was running international, including Europe, for Atari. After the Atari thing fell apart, Bruhl founded his own consulting company in the game business, IDG. He was contracted by Sega when Sega was starting to look into getting into the console market. He used his expertise to help them figure out what they wanted to do to launch in North America and the rest of the world and everything. So I don't know exactly how, but they end up connecting with Anton Bruhl. Bruhl learns about their ambitions here, and he's like, well, you know, I'm repping this company called Sega that is also going to be bringing out a console, the Master System. In late 1986, Herman travels to Japan to meet with Hayao Nakayama and David Rosen, who at the time of this recording just passed away at the age of 95, David Rosen, and was like, hey, we would like to have the UK rights to distribute the Master System. You know, they negotiate whatever, and they're like, sure, we can do that. Now, there's just one problem. This is going to take a lot of money because they're going to have to take a lot of inventory up front, and this is expensive inventory. This is consoles and cartridges. This isn't cassettes. This is right in the period of time when they're having a lot of issues.
You can't just duplicate a tape if you spill them or something.
Sure. The budget software market is not doing as well. They tried to compensate. I don't know the exact logic behind this. Though I think the logic was that in this period of time, as we've talked about in other episodes, like our Ocean episode and our Elite Systems episode, arcade licenses were very popular at this time. Incredibly popular in the United Kingdom. Conversions. Games like Outrun and Commando and Renegade. All of the latest arcade hits. So I assume that they were like, the arcade games are super popular, but with the way we're trying to keep costs down, we don't want to go out and seek those licenses. They decided they would do their own coin-op games, based around the Commodore Amiga chipset. They created something called the Arcadia, based on the Amiga hardware, and tried to make their own coin-op games. Throughout the history of the company, the fact that they have not been big game people, don't play games, don't know about games, don't care about games, has not been a problem because they've understood retail so well.
They understand the business side of it, and then here they are trying to get into the development side, and they have no clue.
Right, and not only get into the development side, but also branch out into the coin-op business, which is a completely different business than the retail business that they are experts in. This does not go well. They have no understanding about the differences. Their idea was, we can make these arcade games, they'll be relatively low-cost arcade games based on Amiga hardware, and then we can just convert those to the Amiga, and it'll be a cheap conversion, and we can make lots of money because it'll be cheap development on the Amiga, and then we'll make a lot of money on them. They didn't know the differences between coin-op games made to suck up your quarters and computer games meant to engage you in a different way. They're very different kind of games. They had no idea how any of that worked. The Arcadia concept did not do well. It lost them money. While the company was still fine, like they were still moving along, they didn't have a lot of excess capital lying around to suddenly get into the console business. So this is why in 1987, they end up making a deal with the company Virgin, Richard Branson's company, big entertainment media conglomerate, rather, not like a media company. Virgin has a small games division. We won't go into their history now. We'll talk about them when we talk about Virgin in our next episode. They have a small games division. They're in this business. They're interested in the Mastertronic budget line because at this point, even though budget's starting to fade, budget is still a major market category and Virgin's not really in it. Some of the other companies have gotten into it, but not so much Virgin. They're interested in having a larger presence in the budget software space. Mastertronic needs capital from a bigger company in order to get into this Master System business. So in early 1987, they make a deal with Virgin where Virgin takes a 45% stake in Mastertronic so that they can get into the budget software. Using the money from that Virgin deal, they're able to get things set up. They use their retail contacts to get some decent pre-orders in excess of 25,000 systems from various UK retailers. Things are looking great. Then Sega screws up the 1987 launch because they don't get their stock into Europe until Boxing Day, which is December 26th, the day after Christmas.
But I can just give the kid an IOU and you'll get it the next day.
No, because the inventory wasn't around. A lot of orders get canceled. A lot of inventory goes unsold. It's something of a disaster. They sell some units, but they also lose a lot of orders and end up with backed up inventory. This is a disaster across Europe. They were launching in 3 major markets. They were launching in the UK with Mastertronic. They were launching in France with a company called Master Games, fronted by a guy named Cameron McSween, who had been involved in the early ball and paddle business in the United Kingdom. With VideoMaster, we talk about them in one of our Pong Clone episodes, and our first 10 years of European consoles. They were launching in Germany through a subsidiary of the Bertelsmann Group, which is a big company over there. None of these companies got their inventory in time. Bertelsmann was so upset about this that they just cut off everything and said they would never work with Sega again. Master Games and Mastertronic were both put in severe financial straits by this. As a result of that, in 1988, Virgin ends up buying the remainder of Mastertronic. The company is rebranded as Virgin Mastertronic. But there's also an opportunity here because they had a lot of interest with the Master System in 87. They're confident that once they have proper stock, they're going to be able to continue selling this thing. But now, because of the debacles in Germany and France, those markets are available too. So Virgin Mastertronic ends up taking over Master System distribution in not just the UK, but also France and Germany. With the help of Virgin, for instance, in France, a subsidiary Virgin Loisirs that ends up doing the actual distributing of the system, but Mastertronic's the one that, got the deal all in place. Even though 87 ends up being a bit of a problem, they do much better in 88. Moving forward from there, they're very successful in selling the Master System and later on the Mega Drive. Because they are kind of servicing all of the major Western European markets, they pick up Spain as well in 1990. They are kind of able to penetrate the market a little better in some ways than Nintendo, which is approaching it in a more piecemeal way. They end up running neck and neck with Nintendo, and in some countries like the United Kingdom, even surpassing Nintendo in sales. So this becomes a very lucrative thing for Mastertronic, now Virgin Mastertronic, in the last years of the 1980s. There's just one little problem with that, though. It kind of becomes the tail wagging the dog. because Virgin Games and Virgin Mastertronic are, in theory, sellers of software. Now, suddenly, they are about the largest sellers of video game hardware in Western Europe.
Wouldn't that be good? I'm selling hardware that you play the software on.
It's good in a lot of ways. Obviously, they're making some money on this thing, but it's bad in the sense that they have to buy and stock a lot of expensive inventory. You have to spend a lot of money to make money in this business. Virgin isn't necessarily comfortable with that. It's a lucrative business, but it's a hard business. Virgin basically makes the decision that they do not want to be involved in this hardware business anymore. So what happens is that Virgin Games / Virgin Mastertronic gets split in two. Nick Alexander, who's the head of Virgin Games, we'll talk about him more when we do our Virgin episode. Frank Herman, who has been running Virgin Mastertronic out of the UK, and Alan Sharam take the console business, which Sega acquires and turns into Sega Europe. So Sega takes direct control of distributing the Master System, the Mega Drive, and all of the games in Europe, but it does it with all of the people that had been part of Virgin Mastertronic that had been doing this on their end. The software business continues on at Virgin, including that American outpost, Mastertronic Inc., that was being run by Martin Alper. So Martin Alper and other people stay on at Virgin, which becomes Virgin Interactive Entertainment. Not sure if it becomes that right away or a little bit later, but we'll cover that in our next episode. And continues on with the software publishing business. That's basically the end of Mastertronic. I mean, it is the end of Mastertronic. Like, you could say the end of Mastertronic was 1988 when Virgin bought it and became Virgin Mastertronic, but during that period, it still maintains something of a unique identity within Virgin Games. Now, all of that unique identity has basically gone over to Sega Europe, brand new company, other than the American stuff with Alper that is now part of Virgin Games / Virgin Interactive Entertainment. So 1991 is kind of the final endpoint of this company, Mastertronic.
Really, this is all sorts of stealth here because we have sneaky budget software that secretly turned into a Sega episode.
Ha! Something like that, yes. Obviously, we didn't go into too much of the details on what was going on the Sega side of things. Someday we might. But yes, at the end of the day, there is a lot of Sega shenanigans involved here. And Sega was very successful in Europe, far more successful in Europe than it was in the United States and Japan. Sometimes that success has been overstated. Nintendo did better than a lot of people think, but Sega did really well, and specifically in the United Kingdom, they did substantially better. In other countries, it was a little closer, but in the UK, it was basically no contest. That's a whole nother episode talking about the console war in Europe. I don't want to tack that on to the end of a Mastertronic episode. But yeah, the Mastertronic people were the ones that made that possible. I think in large part because they almost by accident were able to take over almost all of Western European distribution and kind of had a more uniform, concentrated approach, whereas the Nintendo approach was more fragmented, more piecemeal. Larger companies like Mattel and Bandai that weren't really relying on the NES for their success, probably in the same way that Mastertronic was. So Mastertronic was hungrier and more coordinated and more driven and had such great distribution, especially with the help of the Virgin Group as well. Because like I said, their distribution was really UK. France, they were helped by Virgin. I don't know as much about the situation in Germany, but yeah, I mean, they did great with it. So great that Sega was like, nah, we want you to work for us now. And so they did. From pioneering budget software to making Sega a success in Europe, Mastertronic was a real pioneer, even though none of the founders were particularly interested in games. They made some missteps along the way, but they always had enough going on that they were doing right to keep things going until they were bought by Virgin and then carved up between Virgin and Sega.
We'll just continue the story in our next episode when we go back across the Atlantic in order to look at this Virgin Interactive thing and what the little vestiges of Mastertronic decided to do.
That's right. And we'll also go back in time a little bit as well, because Virgin Games did exist before they absorbed Mastertronic. We'll look at the early history of Virgin Games in Europe, and then we'll discuss Virgin Interactive Entertainment and what they did on both sides of the pond after that split of the Mastertronic Sega stuff and the software stuff.
Always amazes me how all these things intertwine in their weird ways.
Absolutely.
We'll tell you more about it next time on They Create Worlds. Check out our show notes at podcast.theycreateworlds.com, where we have links to some of the things we discussed in this and other episodes. You can check out Alex's video game history blog at videogamehistorian.wordpress.com. Alex's book, They Create Worlds, the story of the people and companies that shaped the video game industry, Volume 1, can now be ordered through CRC Press and at major online retailers. Feel free to email us at feedback@theycreateworlds.com. Please consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/theycreateworlds. If you do decide to support us, please do so through the website and not through the iOS app. This saves you from the 30% Apple markup. We understand that you may not be able to financially support us, but you can still support us by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and the podcasting service that you use. The podcast is now available on YouTube. Please like and subscribe. Intro music is Airplane Mode by Josh Woodward, found at joshwoodward.com/song/airplane mode, used under a Creative Commons Attribution license. Outro music is Bacterial Love by Roll Music, found at freemusicarchive.org, used under a Creative Commons Attribution license.